Hi guys, I'm Talia's Threads and today we are hacking the Wavelength bag. So this is the large version of my pattern, the Wavelength bag, and I've quilted it with chevrons and I've quilted the outer and the lining onto the quilt batting. So essentially we're sewing without a lining. And I've extended the strap so that it's a crossbody. So I'll be going through all of the changes and explaining to you how I did it. So yeah, let's get into it. I've been waiting to do this for a while because this nylon Taslan from Ripstop by the Roll is my favorite fabric ever, but they've been sold out of it for ages. So even though I'd like to do one in this fabric, I'm going to just go ahead and do it because I can't wait to wear this bag. However, I do have 3/8 inch binding made out of it that I'm going to use. Now the pattern does call for 3/8 inch binding, however with all the layers of the quilt batting, I'm going to assess how I feel closer to doing the binding, but I may go wider to 1/2 inch binding because obviously you need to reach around that extra distance from the thickness. So just be aware of that if you are buying bias binding. However, I do recommend making it because it's super easy. And then for my lining fabric, I'm going to use this rayon twill, and I was considering using this for the outside fabric as well, because this nylon Taslan that I bought is coated and it makes it like a little bit more stiff, a little bit more thick, and I thought it's not going to show the quilting lines as nicely, and of course on a plain black bag you'd like to show them up. However, I did this little swatch, and even though I think I want to change the quilting, and I will show you how I do it, the design, I really love how it's showing up, and I do think it's holding the texture really nicely, so I'm happy about that. This is the rayon twill side. And then because we are quilting, I'm going to be relying heavily on my ruler, one with angles on it. However, you can guess the angles, you can free motion quilt. I don't even know if that's what it's called, but you know, with the little circle foot, you can do like whatever design you like. And then I'm using this chalk pen. It has a roller and it's like powder chalk inside, and it's my favorite thing for marking when I have a lot to mark, especially on a fabric like this that is not going to show up like any of the colors or wash away pens. Then I'm going to use this 505 temporary adhesive from Odiv, I think it is. I'm using this because this is not really pinnable. I'm going to pierce it and it's going to look terrible, and also it's really difficult to pin through. So I will be spray basting my layers all together before I quilt it. And then I'm going to use this cotton quilt batting, and in the front and the back panels I'm going to, so the main panel, I'm going to use 2 layers, and in the part of the gusset that sort of goes around the main body of the bag, I'm also going to use 2 layers of quilt batting. And then in the top of the gusset that becomes the strap, and then like the strap tab which becomes the inner strap, I'm going to use 1 layer of quilt batting because obviously I don't want it to start being super bulky in the strap when it doesn't need to be. And I'm also sewing without a lining. I'm going to quilt the lining directly onto the inside of the quilt batting, and then I'm going to bind the seams, but I'm going to show you how to do it. So I won't be putting a pocket in today. And finally, sewing clips. Now the pattern does call for sewing clips, however in this one you won't even be able to get pins through it. Just a few extra things that I think you'll need now I've finished the project. So I started wearing a mask when I was using the spray glue. It doesn't instruct you to, but I just really felt like it was getting into my throat and it was horrible. So a few extra bobbins because we're quilting the fabric, so that was pretty thread intensive, and so if you can preload a few bobbins then that would be really helpful to the flow of the project. This twill tape is what I end up using to like cover the bulky seams. I believe this one is 3/8 inch. It would have been nice if I had something that was like 1/2 inch. Of course you could try with like strips of fabric where you folded the edges in and ribbon, something like that, but this ended up being a much better solution because I was going to bias bind the bulky seams. And then double-sided seam tape. This is mentioned in the requirements for the original pattern, but I used it a lot. I used it to attach the zipper, so if you don't have this you probably will have quite a difficult time getting things like properly in alignment. I just drew roughly around this main panel, and I will be showing you the whole process on the main panel because the gusset's so huge, but the principles are the same for all of the quilting. So I'm going to use this as a template, and I'm just going to cut out my batting and then my outer fabric. This is my lining. Make sure everything's pressed really well. This nylon Taslan I can't press, but I will try and smooth it out as best I can if there's any creases in it. And then we can move on to drawing the quilting lines. Okay, I am actually going to try and press this on a really low temperature from this non-coated side because I'm scared that these little puckers are going to show up. And I've just put this paper down for the spray glue. That reacted a tiny bit weirdly. The nylon Taslan does shrink a tiny bit when you iron it, and then it will grow again, so hopefully it won't be noticeable, but now there's no puckers, so I'm really happy with that. Okay, so I'm going to mark my notches, and then that's going to give me my grain line. I mean, obviously there's a grain line in the fabric, but it's really difficult to see. So this is the line I'm going to take my angles from. And then, seems counterintuitive because I'm doing a chevron stripe, but I'm going to draw like a diamond check pattern and see if I can wipe off in between because I want it to be really accurate and uniform throughout. And I'm using the 30-degree quilting line because on this one, I think I probably used 45, but I just eyeballed it. I measured and it was somewhere in between, but closer to 45. And I want them to be more like diagonal. I don't know how else to describe it. And I think I want them to be a bit closer together. So this was 1 inch, and I think I'm going to use 3/4 inches on this one. And I'm just lining up. I guess it doesn't matter where I start. I just want one of the chevrons to be completely centered in the middle, but I'll focus on that when I come to cutting out as well. And I'm just literally lining up the ruler with the 3/4 inch mark and marking all of my lines. Let me tell you, you need to get one of these pens. It's so good. Okay, and now I'm just going to mark the opposite lines and just trying to center the chevron over the middle instead of like starting it over here, if that makes sense. I was going to try and wipe some of this off so that I can see where my chevron lines are, but I feel like I'm going to wipe too many lines away. So I'm just going to try really hard not to get confused at the machine. So I'm just starting at one side and I'm going up one line and back down in a zigzag motion. And then once I get to the end of that line, I will just move one down and go in a zigzag motion on that one below, trying to ignore sort of like the lines in between. I hope as you're watching this it's going to make sense. I have done all the quilting lines, but I realized I made a mistake and I should have just taken a moment to think about how I wanted it to look in my head. So what I did was I went up one, down one, up one, down one, and what I wanted to do was go up two, down two, and then it would have like the zigzags going inside of each other, like bigger zigzags inside of each other. Luckily there's two sides of a bag and I don't really mind having them slightly different, so I'm gonna mark it up the exact same as I did with this one, but I'm gonna go up two, down two. Finish the second panel, and this is what I meant by like the chevrons. Before we move on to cutting out, I just want to show you the adjustment that I've made to the pattern pieces. So this is the strap extension, And because the pattern piece is cut on the fold, every one wave you add to this pattern piece will add 2 waves to the final strap. So I wanted to add 3 waves, so I folded one of them in half to find the midway point, and I cut off the end, and then I'm just going to stick that on there, and that's going to extend my strap by 3 waves. And I've done the exact same to the gusset. This is the normal gusset, and it would be cut on fold here, and then I traced off this and scribbled fold here so that I don't forget. So now I have my extended gusset with a longer strap because I want this bag to sit as a crossbody. Just want to show you what I'm doing with the strap tab. I drew a midline both ways, and then using the 30-degree mark on the ruler, I drew a diamond in the middle, and then I was going to do 3/4 inch like I did on the main panel, but I figured that's a lot of work, especially because the gusset is going to be so much bigger and I want to do the same with the gusset. So I used the 1 inch mark to draw the lines coming out, and it looks like these chevrons. The reason I did the diamond is because I want them coming down in the same way on both sides. I'm just drawing my quilting lines on the gusset, and as you can see it's huge, but if you did want to do this, I would definitely recommend having a thinner layer in the strap like I'm doing. So I just measured the distance to these notches. This is the notch where basically the gusset meets the bag. I hope you can see that on camera. And then I doubled it and I put the midline in the middle, and then you probably can't see, but there's little notches here in the sides of my fabric that show where it goes to like double quilt batting, and then this bit is single because it's going to lay with the strap. I am ready to cut out my pieces, and I can still faintly see this grain line that I drew, so I'm lining that up. But if you can't see the grain line or you didn't draw one, then you can also fold the pattern piece in half, and I want mine centered over like the downward facing chevron, so I can match that up and then just unfold the pattern piece. And I don't have many pattern weights. I just stole a few of these from my husband, but they're good enough with my phone. And even though I'm changing the construction, I'm not making any modifications to the pattern pieces, but I'm going to go back through after and remove the seam allowance from the zipper here, because I'm going to bias bind the edge and then just lay it over the zipper. The seam allowance is 1/4 inch, and I will actually remove 3/8 inch because I want to account for the tiny bit of thickness that the bias binding is going to then add to the edge once I've sewn it on. And I'm just marking out my 3/8 inch manually. And I'll just blend the curve as I cut. And then for my strap tab and the gusset, I'm going to just mark the midpoint by folding them so that I can line them up with the midlines. And then I'll just cut out one side at a time, flip it over, and then do the other side. I have my gusset here, and what I was going to do is bias bind the raw edges at the bottom and then sew them right sides together and fold back the bias bound edges and sort of top stitch them open. But I'm playing around with this and it is really bulky, and even though I have an industrial machine that I could sew that part on, I just think it's not gonna look great. So I'm gonna experiment a little and remove the seam allowance. And then I'm just going to like push them up against each other with the removed seam allowance and zigzag over to keep them in place, just with like quite a narrow zigzag, because I don't have very wide twill tape. I think this is 3/8 inch wide twill tape. So then what I'm going to do is place it over and top stitch it down on both sides so that the raw seam is covered. And I won't show you both sides, but I attached the twill tape to the lining first and then to the outer fabric so that there isn't two lines of stitching showing on the outside. Okay, I feel like that worked really beautifully and I really like the finish. So I'm gonna go and bias bind the top edge of the main panels, and then I'm gonna simmer on how I want to finish the edge here. Once the zipper is attached between the panels, this is where the strap tab is gonna attach. And I wonder, will I take the seam allowance off and finish like this? It will be a bit tricky because by then the bag's becoming like 3D a little bit, but this is really nice and flat. It doesn't create any bulk, and I just think it's going to give a beautiful finish if I can make it work. Okay, so I just realized that there's going to be raw edges on the sides of the zipper tab inside. Even if I do like a lining one, these bits here are going to be raw. So I'm just making it up as I go along. So I'm going to add seam allowance onto both sides of the zipper tab, and then cut out these wider pattern pieces ready to finish the edges before I attach the zipper. So now the edge that attaches to the zipper is no longer the short edge, it's the long edge since adding the seam allowance on the sides. So I'm going to press one of the long edges down 3/8 inch, and then I'm going to put them right sides facing and sew down the edge. So then when I flip it, this raw edge will be inside, and I will just try and shimmy the zipper in and hope that it fits. Okay, I just sewed this and I'm gonna finger press the edges open. Also, if you can hear anything, it's my dog with a snuffle mat. He's sniffing and like digging right now. Now I'm just going to slide it over my zipper, and I'm going to try and get the seam allowance underneath the zipper so that it won't show on the outside of the bag. If you're not using a nylon coil zipper, make sure that you're resizing it properly. I just cut mine a little bit longer than the zipper measurement in the instructions, and I'm going to sew over it because it's just nylon coil. So and I just stitched over that last stitching line and then right at the edge. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the zipper to the top of the main panel, and I'm going to do that with this double-sided seam tape. I'm just going to stick it all along the edge of the zipper, and then starting from the midpoint I'll stick out towards the edges, and then I'll show you how I top stitch it down. And I'm going to stitch on both sides of the bias tape, starting with the side that's closest to the zipper. I'm going to stitch down really carefully, and then I'm going to go and follow the previous line of stitching on the side closest to the bag. It's a little more tricky to match up the other side, and you might want to start trying like that, but I recommend having the lining facing up, and then we can put this lining facing down and sort of like shimmy it along like that. The main panels are attached, and I am going to chop off the seam allowance. I'm terrified, but I think it's going to be way too bulky if I bias bind the seams and try and fold them, and this has got binding, and it's just going to get too much. I think I'm going to clip the gusset on quickly and try and clip it all in place just to see exactly how much I want to cut off, especially because of the thickness of the batting could have sort of affected how the seams match up a little bit. I just use my notch to find roughly where this wave needs to be. Matches up perfectly. I did trim this side down a tiny bit. This side has got something funky going on. I think I'm just going to try and cover it up with 2 layers of twill tape, and then I'll trim it so that it sits flush and nobody will notice. I'm not sure what I did here. So now I know everything matches up, I am just going to literally push these up against each other and attach them in the same way as I attach the bottom of the gusset. So I'm going to zigzag stitch across and then put some twill tape over it. Okay, this side looks awesome. This side doesn't quite look perfect. I had to do 2 layers of twill, but I think it blends in nicely. I just have a damp towel here, and I'm gonna wipe off all of the quilting lines before I make this bag like 3D, because otherwise it's gonna be really difficult to wipe them off. Now I'm just gonna baste the gusset and the main panel together, and then we can move on to the bias binding. Okay, here she is. I am so excited. I just had a little try on and it sits at the perfect height. I'm just obsessed with this bag. So next is the binding, and I do feel a little bit nervous about binding this because my machine was not loving the layers where it was 4 layers of quilt batting. However, I pulled some of my scraps out of the trash, and I've done an experiment here with the 3/8 inch wide binding because I have loads of 3/8 inch nylon Taslan binding that I've already made, and I'm nothing but lazy, so it actually looks kind of good. You can see the stitching line here from where I top stitched because I just wanted to see if it would reach around, but this side looks absolutely beautiful. So I think either I can choose which side I like and top stitch on the machine and just know that there will be a little bit of overlap on the stitching, or I'll hand stitch, but I just don't know if I'm cut out for that at this moment in time. I did stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, but it was probably slightly more of a scant quarter, and it's definitely come over like 3/8 inch on the back side still. But I did do quite a lot of like pulling, folding, really tugging on it because obviously it's so thick. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and use this binding, and I'll do the first pass, and then I can try and do the second pass on the machine, and if it's really not working out, then I can hand stitch it.